Imagine you're going about your day, living in ancient Greece. Someone walks up to you and says, "You think movement is real? Do you think Achilles could outrun a turtle? You think an arrow actually flies through the air?" Wrong. Not because of science, not because of magic, but because of logic. That man was Zeno of Elea, one of the strangest, sharpest, and most influential thinkers in the history of philosophy. More than 2,400 years later, mathematicians, physicists, and philosophers are still talking about his arguments. Zeno didn't build a giant philosophical system like Plato or Aristotle. He didn't leave behind huge books. But what he left behind were paradoxes, intellectual traps so powerful that they shook the foundations of logic, mathematics, and even reality itself. This is the story of a philosopher who declared war on common sense. Let's travel back to ancient Greece, before the modern science, before our universities, before formal mathematics. This was the age of the pre Socratics. These philosophers were trying to answer one big question: what is reality actually made of? Some said everything came from water, others said fire. Others believed reality was built from tiny invisible atoms. But one philosopher stood apart from all the others: Parmenides. Parmenides was Zeno's teacher. He argued something almost impossible to accept: change is an illusion. Now think about that. Not just some changes, all change. According to Parmenides, nothing truly comes into existence, nothing truly disappears, movement is impossible, reality is eternal and unchanging. Why?
Why? Why? Why? Why? Why?
Because he believed that what does exist exists, and what does not exist cannot exist. And if non-being cannot exist, then change becomes impossible, because change would require something to move from what is not to what is. To Parmenides, that was irrational. So the world of motion, growth, death, and transformation, the world that you and I experience every day, was merely deceptive appearance. Most people thought this was insane, and that's where Zeno enters the story. So who was he? Zeno was born around 490 BCE in the Greek city of Elea in southern Italy. Very little is known about his life with certainty, but ancient writers describe him as fiercely intelligent, politically active, and deeply loyal to Parmenides. Some accounts even suggest the two were extremely close companions. According to later stories, Zeno may have died heroically while resisting a tyrant. One legendary tale claims he refused to betray his allies under torture and bit off his own tongue rather than speak. Whether that's true or not, the legend tells us all something important. The Greeks saw Zeno as fearless, but his real battlefield wasn't politics, it was logic. Here's what made him brilliant. He didn't merely say Parmenides is right. Instead, he used a strategy called reductio ad absurdum, which means assume your opponent is correct, then show their belief leads to absurdity. Zeno accepted ordinary assumptions about motion and plurality, then used logic to destroy them from the inside. His arguments were basically philosophical landmines. At first they seem simple, then suddenly your brain collapses inward. Let's start with his most famous paradox, the dichotomy paradox. Suppose you went to walk in a room. Seems easy, right? Zeno says, not so fast. Before you can cross the room, you must first reach the halfway point. But before reaching the halfway point, you must reach the quarter-way point. Before that, the eighth-way point, then the 16th, then the 32nd, and so on forever. Mathematically, the distance can be divided infinitely. So to complete the journey, you must complete an infinite number of steps. And Zeno asks, how can you complete infinitely many tasks in a finite amount of time? If infinitely many divisions exist, motion seems impossible. Modern mathematical responses, calculus would provide an answer. 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 plus ... equals 1. Shows that infinitely many smaller distances can still add up to a finite total. This became foundational to modern mathematics. But here's the important thing. Zeno exposed a genuine problem involving infinity, continuity, and space, and that problem terrified thinkers for centuries. This is the paradox everyone remembers, however. Imagine the legendary Greek warrior Achilles racing a tortoise. Achilles is vastly faster, So to make things fair, the tortoise gets a head start. Now Zeno says when Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise has slightly moved ahead. Then Achilles reaches that point, but the tortoise has moved again, and again, and again forever. So Achilles can never actually overtake the tortoise. Absurd? Well, yeah, of course. But that's the point. Zeno forces you into a contradiction between logic, infinity, and sensory experience. Your eyes say Achilles wins. Logic seems to say he never can. Before Zeno, infinity was mostly vague and mystical, but he weaponized it. He showed that infinite divisibility creates shocking logical consequences, and this paradox helped inspire later developments in calculus, limits, infinite series, and mathematical analysis. Without paradoxes like these, modern mathematics may have developed very differently. The arrow paradox. Imagine an arrow flying through the air. Sounds like motion, looks like motion, right? Zeno says no. At any single instant in time, that arrow occupies one exact position. In that instant, it is not moving anywhere. It simply is where it is. And if every instant is motionless, then motion itself is impossible. This paradox attacks the very concept of time. Is time made of indivisible instants? If so, how can movement emerge from frozen moments? This question still appears in modern physics and philosophy. Even today, debates about space-time, quantum mechanics, and continuity echo Zeno's concerns. This one is harder but incredibly important. Zeno imagines rows of moving bodies passing each other. Using assumptions about time and space, he derives contradictions involving relative motion. The details are complex, but the point is devastating. Our intuitive ideas about motion produce logical inconsistencies. And here's what's fascinating. Modern physicists discovered centuries later that motion and time really are strange. Under theory of relativity, time can slow down, simultaneously break down. Motion depends on frames of reference. Zeno wasn't doing physics, but he was uncovering deep structural problems in how humans think about space and motion. So this is where many people misunderstand him. Zeno may not literally have believed nothing moves. Instead, he may have been defending Parmenides by showing ordinary assumptions lead to contradictions. In other words, if you think motion is simple and obvious, explain these paradoxes. And really, that challenge still matters, because the deeper science digs into reality, the weirder things become. Aristotle tried to solve Zeno by distinguishing between actual infinity and potential infinity. He argued you could never complete infinite tasks all at once. Instead, divisions exist potentially, not as completed realities. This became enormously influential. Islamic and Christian philosophers wrestled with Zeno for centuries. His paradoxes became central debates about continuity, God, causation, time, and infinity. The real breakthrough came with calculus. Thinkers like Isaac Newton, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed tools for dealing rigorously with infinity and motion. Later, mathematics formalized limits and convergence series. This allowed modern science to mathematically describe motion despite infinite divisibility. Many people say calculus solved the paradoxes completely. Others disagree, because calculus explains how infinite series can converge mathematically. But some philosophers argue Zeno's deeper questions remain. What is space? What is time? Are instants real? Is continuity fundamental? Is motion ultimately intelligible? These questions appear in metaphysics, quantum theory, philosophy of mathematics, and theoretical physics. So in a strange way, Zeno never entirely lost. His influence is enormous. He helped shape logic. His use of reductio ad absurdum became foundational in philosophy and mathematics. His paradoxes forced thinkers to confront infinity seriously. Questions about continuity and motion remain deeply important. Zeno demonstrates something profound. Common sense is not always philosophically safe. Reality may be far stranger than it appears. This is why he still remains fascinating to look at. He represents a moment where human reason turned against everyday experience. You see motion, you feel change, yet Zeno asks, can you logically explain it? And suddenly the obvious becomes mysterious. That's philosophy at its highest level, not giving easy answers, but exposing hidden assumptions beneath reality itself. Now, Zeno of Elea left behind no giant empire, no scientific laboratory, no military conquest, just a collection of paradoxes. and yet those paradoxes echoed through ancient philosophy, medieval theology, modern mathematics, and theoretical physics. More than 2 millennia later, humanity is still wrestling with the questions he raised. Can space be infinitely divided? What is motion? What is time? Can logic overtake the evidence of the senses? Zeno transformed paradox into a weapon, and once you truly understand his arguments, you might never look at movement the same way again. People usually treat Socrates as the master of dismantling arguments, but Zeno was doing this earlier. According to Aristotle, Zeno essentially invented dialectic combat as a formal weapon. This matters because before Zeno, philosophers mostly said, here's what reality is. Zeno said, fine, let's assume you're right and see what breaks. That shift changed philosophy forever. It created the blueprint for formal proof by contradiction, courtroom-style reasoning, logical stress testing, and skeptical analysis. That eventually shaped Western logic itself. Without Zeno, later traditions of rigorous philosophical argument might have developed very differently. A lot of people think radical doubt begins with Descartes. Not really. Zeno is doing something similar 2,000 years earlier. He's basically asking, why trust your senses if reason contradicts them? Your eyes say motion exists, plurality exists, change exists. But reason says motion creates contradiction, plurality creates contradiction. Change seems to be logically impossible. That tension becomes one of philosophy's oldest problems. What is more trustworthy, reason or perception? This becomes central later for Plato, rationalists, empiricists, and modern epistemology. Zeno helped launch that war. Everybody remembers Achilles. Almost nobody talks about Zeno's attack on plurality itself. His argument goes like this. If many things exist, they must be infinitely small, because divisible, infinitely large, because composed of infinite parts. That sounds contradictory, so plurality itself becomes incoherent. That's insane if you really sit with it. He's basically asking, how can things be made of parts if those parts either have size or don't? If they have size, infinite divisibility makes objects infinitely large. If they don't, adding zero-size things never creates extension. That problem haunted mathematics for centuries. It touches modern questions about point particles, infinitesimals, spatial continuity, quantum discretion, quantum discreteness. This is way deeper than slow turtle joke. This is one of philosophy's coolest historical ironies. Zeno wanted to defend Parmenides' claim that motion was impossible. Instead, his paradoxes forced later thinkers to invent mathematics needed to explain motion. That means Zeno indirectly helped inspire limits or convergence, calculus, and real analysis. So the guy trying to prove motion impossible helped create the tools that explain motion. That's one of the funniest twists in intellectual history. Modern physicists sometimes reopen Zeno-like question. For example, quantum jumping. Electrons don't always move like little balls traveling continuously. Sometimes they seem to transition discretely. That raises old Zeno-style questions about continuity. Some physicists speculate space-time may not be infinitely divisible. If true, Zeno's assumptions about endless division might fail. That could radically alter his paradoxes. Quantum Zeno effect. It shows that repeatedly observing a quantum system can inhibit its evolution. In simple terms, constant observation can freeze change. That's literally named after Zeno because it echoes his idea that motion/change becomes impossible under certain analysis. That's an awesome modern callback. This might be a fun interpretation. Some scholars think Zeno's paradoxes were partly intellectual performance art. Not jokes exactly, but provocations. He may have enjoyed cornering people into impossible logical traps just to expose their shallow assumptions. Basically, he was the ancient Greek version of that person who calmly says, define what you mean by movement, and suddenly everyone regrets speaking. That makes him weirdly modern. He feels like someone from a logic forum dropped into the 5th century BCE Greece. In Parmenides, Plato presents Zeno as dazzling and difficult, almost intellectually intimidating. He's portrayed like a master tactician who can make any position collapse if handled carelessly. That reputation lasted centuries. He wasn't just respected, he was feared intellectually. Zeno teaches us that reality being obvious doesn't mean reality is understood. You can watch motion your whole life. You can build your entire worldview around change, and still be unable to explain what either truly is. That's philosophy's superpower. It turns the familiar into mystery, and Zeno may have been the first philosopher to weaponize that mystery at full force.